I want to talk about some basic math conventions today. The first thing I want to talk about is labels. Labels can be tricky. It is important, of course, to always label your work. One thing that particularly can trip people up is labeling dollar amounts, monetary values. I'm gonna have to move this a little bit. Sorry. So it shows up. Okay. So when labeling an amount like $57.45, the dollar sign is always the first thing we say. This is $57.45. The dollar sign always comes first, and that's somewhat unusual in labels. Other labels always come at the end. 38%, 4 centimeters, 7.5 feet. 12 items. And it gets a little even more confusing because we're talking about purely cents. In that case, our label goes at the end. This is 5 cents. Cents always goes at the end. A dollar sign always goes at the beginning. 5 cents, when written with a dollar sign, would look like this. 0.05 with a dollar sign in the front. So again, when it comes to labels, we're dealing with monetary amounts. The dollar sign always comes first, no matter what. If, by the way, you're ever writing a paper, we usually spell this out if it was an even number. So in math, we say $60. In paper writing, depending on our audience, we might say $60 or $60 with the words spelled out. Those all mean the same thing, of course. Different contexts call for different writing. The other thing I wanted to mention was with rounding and precision. If I have this number, 17 and 3,459 10,000ths, and if I want to round it, my decimal point matters, and what goes after it matters when we're dealing with rounding. That's a precision issue. And so if I'm rounding this to the nearest 10, I'm going to have 20. Notice by convention, if we have a whole number with no decimals behind it, we don't include the decimal point. This is not 20 decimal point, it's just 20. If I'm rounding it to the nearest whole number, I of course round it to 17. If I'm rounding it to the nearest tenth, I have 17 and 3/10. The nearest hundredth, 17 and 35 hundredths. And the nearest thousandth, 17 and 346 thousandths. Notice that although 17 and 3/10 is the same as 17 and 30 hundredths, I'm not going to put a 0 there. I'm not putting a 0 there because I'm rounding to the nearest tenth. If I had this number, sorry, let me move that over a little bit. So 17 and 3,001 10,000ths. I'm going to do the same thing. The nearest tens, well, that's still closest to 20. The nearest ones, that's still closest to 17. The nearest tenth is still 17 and 3/10. What about my nearest hundredth? Well, now my nearest hundredth is 17 and 30 hundredths. What about my nearest thousandth? Well, now it's 17 and 300 thousandths. Even though these three numbers in other contexts all equal each other, of course. 17 and 3/10 is the same as 17 and 30 hundredths, is the same as 17 and 300 thousandths. Even though they all equal each other, they are different in terms of their precision. And so if you're being asked to round to the nearest hundredth, you want to make sure your answer is in hundredths. 30 hundredths, 35 hundredths. Nearest thousandth, you want to make sure your answer is in thousandths. And again, notice that when we round, we do not leave on an ending decimal point. Just 2017. It is certainly the same as saying this. I can do that. That is the same value. But by convention, we don't include a decimal point after a whole number. I want to continue talking about math conventions by mentioning the importance of spelling. All of you are going to be elementary teachers. The importance of you modeling correct spelling cannot be overstated. This is true on worksheets you create, on when you write on the chalkboard or the whiteboard or the smartboard, in your letters home to parents, in your blog posts, whatever. You are models of educated individuals, and part of that, justly or not, involves spelling. It is particularly important that you spell your vocabulary words correctly. And in math, we have lots of vocabulary. And so one thing I want to remind you of is the importance that you are spelling words like diagonal, which is certainly a word that appears in elementary school a lot, correctly. And my handwriting is poorer than it should be as a former elementary teacher, but that's an O. D-I-A-G-O-N-A-L. Part of this is particularly important when it comes to dealing with decimals. When we talk about place value, we of course in the whole numbers have hundreds and tens and ones, or sometimes hundreds and tens and units as such. And of course these are words that would also be important to spell correctly, and that normally that's not an issue. Where it becomes a little trickier sometimes for people is when we move into decimals, because we have a TH on the end of words, and that sometimes, in just the way English is pronounced, doesn't always sound out very clearly. But it's important you remember when we get to decimals, we're talking about tenths, hundredths, thousandths, and so on. And that those are also spelled correctly with the TH on the end. Similarly, in geometry, along with diagonal, we have lots of vocabulary words that truly need to be spelled correctly. Those include words like similar, congruent, complementary. And we talk about complementary angles. It's with an E. It's not the same compliment as if you tell someone that you like what they're wearing that day. So complementary, C-O-M-P-L-E-M-E-N-T-A-R-Y. Or supplementary, as in supplementary angles. Horizontal, vertical, and so on. And of course, it's one thing to misspell something in, I guess, a live situation. Every teacher occasionally misspells something on the board. Every teacher will occasionally have a spelling error, even in a comment on a kid's paper. That's understandable. But it is important that you truly take your time with spelling, certainly in terms of your classes. When the book is out in front of you, there's no excuse at this point in your education for misspelling words like these that are the vocabulary words of your field.